the football panel. I'm Alexander Williams. I'm going to be the moderator for this session. I'd like to welcome you all here. Hopefully, you've been able to check out some of the other panels so far this day. We want to thank you all for coming to this one especially. Here we're hosting four very distinguished panelists: Eric Eager from PFF, Zach Feldman from NFL Next Gen Stats, Josh Hermsmeyer from 538.com, and Sarah Bailey from the Rams. So thank you all very much for joining us today. I think we should probably start out. The topic for the discussion for this panel is the past, present, and future of football analytics. So we're going to sort of go in order there. As far as the coming from where we are right now, the sort of past and present of football analytics. Josh, I'd like to start with you. Do you think that there's any challenges that are really unique to football with respect to, with football? A lot of people think, well, we look at these other sports, baseball and basketball, and they're pretty far advanced in terms of where they're at analytically, both in terms of the types of statistics that are used, but also in how integrated analytics is into, say, front offices. What do you think sort of the challenges have been with football and advancing football analytics and that sort of thing, as opposed to those other sports?
Yeah, I think there's a common refrain that football is a little different than these other sports. There aren't the head-to-head matchups that you might find in baseball, and maybe sample size issues. But I think that in general, the problems that we try and surmount in football analytics are generally the same ones as in every other sport. And I don't think there's anything particularly novel about the types of solutions we need to come up with to add value with numbers to football. And I think that, our job is to find the right contexts. And I think that, just kind of throwing your hands up and saying you're not capturing all the context. I think Eric and I have talked about this before, I don't think that's the right frame. I think you want to find which contexts are important and adjust for those. But I think Sarah would be the one to talk to your point about, how you integrate it into a workflow into an actual front office and how challenging that can be. The teams I've worked with, or the team I've worked with, they didn't have that problem. They built themselves up that way for the past 10 years. So I think that, that is probably the biggest challenge, that workflow, that pushing evidence-based analysis through the decision-making pipeline is probably the biggest challenge for front offices right now.
Yeah. On that note, Sarah, moving to you, how do you see the Rams integrating analytics into the sort of workflow like Josh was talking about?
Yeah, I think you bring a good point in that most teams do have analysts right now, and so they're receptive to it. And I think football is perceived as behind because it might be ahead in different departments. So, we might use sports science more. I've talked to a couple of baseball teams where we definitely have done that, a little bit more emphasis. So it's really just creating that pipeline and having the people in charge be willing to listen to you and take everything with a grain of salt. The way you present your ideas has to be in a way that's like, this isn't the end all solution. I always harp, like, analytics is another tool. So I'm not coming in saying I have all the answers. I'm coming in with just a different piece of the puzzle that you can use at various stages of your progress, whatever you're using it for.
Yeah, great, thank you. Another topic, thinking about looking back on football analytics over the course of history. One difference perhaps between football analytics and analytics in other sports is that while there are box score statistics, for instance, for all sports that go back 50, 100 years, even more sometimes, for football, it seems as though at least there seems to be a perception that they're perhaps a little less meaningful than, say, in baseball, where even traditional sort of advanced statistics like WOBA or weighted runs above average, that sort of thing, which are factored into wins above replacement calculations, whereas those are directly calculated more or less from singles, doubles, triples, home runs, all of that. Whereas in football, the box score statistics don't seem to have as much weight and as much meaning. and I think this is this maybe to you, Eric. What do you think about sort of that, looking back on historical football data, and perhaps what ways can we deal with that going forward?
I mean, I think what football is a great game in the sense that I think unlike a lot of other games, it's been non-stationary, right? So you look at something as silly as passer rating over time. It used to be just like grading, exams, right? If you were in the 60s, you sucked. If you were in the 70s, you're okay. 80s, pretty good. And the 90s were the exceptional players. And now, we've seen it, if you don't have a passer rating above 90, generally speaking, you're not particularly good. And so there's non-stationarity in there due to the non-stationarity of the game. The fact that, the technology with gloves has changed, the rules have changed, so on and so forth. So, it's very hard. And that's for a position where we actually have pretty rich data on players. We have, play-by-play data for quarterbacks going back a decent ways. For other positions like offensive line, there are offensive linemen who made like 10 consecutive Pro Bowls who, whether it be us or, ESPN measuring pass block win rate or whatever, I don't know if that would happen now. There are players who, are traditionally grade really well for us, but they have down years. Would that preclude them from going to the Pro Bowl, 10 straight years like some guy would in the 80s just based upon reputation? So, I mean, I think that's part of the reason why football is, and I push back a little bit at the idea that football is less receptive. Like hockey is similarly, I would say not behind, but similar. They're probably further behind football than football is, let's say, some of the other sports. But, there are a lot of things that people will say, like, for example, line play, where it's like, we don't have great data on these people going back, even, prior to us at PFF grading these guys. Like, we have nothing on them other than games started. And, that was part of like sort of the religion of football and what made it different, and what made it sort of an insider sport for so long. And that's kind of gone away, not just because of us, but because of the work of ESPN and NGS and all that kind of stuff is sort of making, illuminating things a little bit, for the average person. So I think, as we get further away from the times where we had no data on these players, I think some of those things will go away.
Great, thank you. You mentioned NGS, and Zach, I wanted to pull you in on this one. The NFL Next Gen Stats is a relatively new thing. I don't remember exactly when they started, but they've been sort of in the public eye for about 3 years now. What's the work that you do there, and how do you see that in terms of what it brings to tracking the sort of tracking data that has really just exploded in the last few years? What does that bring over the traditional box score statistics that we have, which in some cases is incredibly limited, as Eric mentioned?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty interesting case because, like right now I'm working with the media side, with NFL Network, NFL Media, anything on .com. And so we need to make sure that we're still doing things for like general public facing, making sure that anyone who can go on the website understands what we're doing. If you turn on NFL Network, and you throw on like game day morning, it's, you're not going to be seeing a lot of formulas and models and things like that where people just change the channel right away. So it's, we're kind of on that edge of, we want to bring in more context that tracking data can give us, but then we have to make sure that people understand kind of what's being told to them. So we have to kind of toe that line a little bit. And I think it's a lot of things like like you said, we started in 2016. This is my first year there, but just kind of listening to my coworkers, we can see how how quickly it's kind of risen in the last few years of getting like on Red Zone. I know like Hanson loves trying to put up stuff as much as we can, and he likes to integrate us a lot. But it really just used to be like, how fast was this guy? Like, did he get like over 20 miles an hour? Like, okay, that's pretty cool. But now we're kind of like, understanding what we can bring to the table more. And I think it also helps with like speed of, you can only watch things so quickly, but if we can get, live model outputs of like route recognition or things like that, we can get in, halftime highlights of, someone's dominating on in-breaking routes where it would take, a few hours to, chart all those routes and all the stats based on them. So I think it's bringing a lot more, kind of like immediate context to people that we didn't have before.
Yeah, sort of going off of that, one thing if you watch Sunday Night Football that you any of our attendees probably would have noticed, ever since Chris Collinsworth became, for instance, the part owner of PFF, we've seen a lot of PFF's grades becoming really integrated into their broadcasts. I know on the player bios, for instance, they always show the position rank. Or for instance, I think you can hardly go a game without seeing the NFL Next Gen stats. Segments come up in between the drives. How do you think this is currently impacting sort of the popular perception of analytics in football? Is this a good thing? And how do you think it will continue? Maybe to Eric first, and then we can keep going.
Football is awesome in the sense that being more analytically sound makes the game more fun. It's not like baseball, as Josh talks about on Twitter, I think a little bit. It's sort of a game we all loved growing up that is kind of not as fun anymore because it's almost a solved problem. Football is great in that, there are a number of different ways to win currently. The sample size is low enough where suboptimal decision-making can yield wins. So there, our evolution towards the maxima are not going to be as fast. And, and what's cool is that it evolves too. Like it's non-stationary in nature. So things that are going to increase your chances of winning today are not going to do so as much 5 years from now. And so, the problems, Sarah, that you solved for the Rams today are going to be different than the ones you solve 5 years from now. And that's cool. That's awesome. That's like what makes the game fun. And I think from a media perspective, that means that, we're never going to get to a place where Chris on Sunday Night Football is talking about literally the same things over and over and over again. I mean, fourth down decisions were a huge deal last night in the game that Buck and Aikman did. And, and it's still sort of cool to be like, in real time to say, oh, look, the Colts missed a fourth down at the Titans 1, and it didn't bury them in this game because there are second order effects to missing that fourth down. That's cool. Like 5 years from now, fourth down might be a solved problem. And now we're talking about different things. We're talking about like, how predictable teams are in coverage, or, the get off rates for defensive linemen or whatever. Like we're going to be talking about deeper and deeper things. And given the appetite for football in this country, like I think that will just make the product so much better. And I think analytics obviously is not, to Sarah's point, it's not the be all end all. It's just one ingredient. But I think what it'll do is it'll help us get to the answer maybe a little bit more quickly than if we didn't have it.
Great, thank you. Josh, it sounds like you want to chime in. You're a member of the media, so your opinion's definitely important here to bring in.
Well, I think that what Eric was alluding to was this idea that in baseball there's 3 true outcomes, and I'm being hyperbolic, but 2 of them are pretty boring. The walk and the strikeout aren't that great. The home run is excellent. Whereas in football, the things that analytics says that we should do more of, more fourth downs, more go for it for 2 points, pass more, downfield more, as best you can with the protection that you're afforded. Those things are far more exciting to watch, and they're far more entertaining and visceral from a viewpoint of a fan. And so I don't think that we're going to go down a road like we have in baseball, perhaps, where everything's a shift and everyone's got an uppercut to their swing, and you got your strikeouts and your home runs, and that's about it. So I do think as Eric said, there's more runway for analytics as the meta changes over time, and I think that's pretty cool.
Well, and even to your point, like in baseball, for the last 2 off seasons, if I'm remembering correctly, we haven't even seen that much activity in the free agency market because everybody has the same information, and in baseball, there's not like a different scheme you can run to win differently than this team, right? Like we talk about Baltimore, we talk about San Francisco, LA, the Rams, like they run unique schemes relative to other teams in the NFL. And so their value system is going to be different than a team like Kansas City who wins differently than other teams. And so like in some sense, the information is the same, but the way that we process it is still going to remain different. And I think in games like baseball, like that just simply isn't the case. Like I could be just, I could be just a rube on how to win baseball games, but I don't think that there's like a schematic way to win in baseball. You get on base and you score runs or you prevent runs. Like there's no, whereas in football, like, the Niners try to win games fundamentally differently than the Chiefs do.
Yeah, I think Sarah, we want to bring you in here working for a team. As we've sort of already alluded to, there's a lot of heterogeneity in the way that different NFL teams go about using analytics and that sort of thing in trying to win a Super Bowl. Whereas in baseball and basketball, for instance, the game seems to have been almost homogenized as a result of analytics. Everyone in baseball is trying to hit home runs. Everyone in basketball trying to make threes and dunk the ball all day. What's your perspective on this?
I personally, I don't think every rock's been uncovered in baseball. I think just the nature of the game of football versus baseball. Baseball is very discrete in its nature. You have X amount of strikeouts, you have X amount of innings. Football is a continuous time frame. You have seconds, you have down, distance. You almost have an infinite number of combinations of scenarios based on what the defense is doing, what the offense is doing, where you are on the field. I think you have so much more that you can do on a given down, distance, and field position that's kind of why you talk about how there's so many problems, is because it's going to take years just to get the correct data or a sample size for a certain situation that you might be interested in. So I do think that you're given a little more flexibility or a little more creativity in what you can look at because of the different opportunities that you have.
Thank you. Speaking of creativity, one thing that I've been really fascinated to look at in the last few years has been the way PFF, I think, has integrated scouting-based methods into analytics, which have, historically, it's sort of a false dichotomy at this point, but historically, it used to be that scouting and analytics were sort of going against each other. Now it seems partly due to the work you guys are doing over at PFF, Eric, but also I think teams have just realized that they want both types of information, really. They want to expand scouting and analytics. So this sort of marriage that you guys have made at PFF has been pretty unique and good to see. How do you think scouting and analytics may continue to sort of merge in the future?
Well, yeah, I think Sarah just talked about this with baseball. It's sort of like, one of the stones that they unturned was this idea of like taking information that scouts have been accumulating for years and turning it into model, features for a model. Like we've always been, this is back before I joined. Like it was, I considered it a scouting company before anything. There were a bunch of people watching games and entering data into spreadsheets and things like that. It's only been for a few years now that my group has been going through and sort of trying to model football with that stuff. So we're certainly, and I know just because we slap numbers on things, we get this this analytics, I think, label, but really like the core of our data set is obviously the charting data, but also the play-by-play grades. Like I think in the future, and it's probably already being done. I don't work for a team, so I don't know, but I'm guessing that this is probably already part of the process. But taking information that really well-trained scouts have been accumulating for years and implementing them into analytics, sort of like more traditional analytics type work, I think that's probably table stakes at this point.
I will chime in there. That's definitely one of the big areas. I think if we go back to even the first question, which is what are some of the struggling, is that it's consistency in those grades. So one of the good things about PFF is you have this curriculum of how you're grading people, and it's been fairly constant over time. You get new general managers, you get new scouts, you find new areas that you want to grade, or you change your grade scale, and you end up having to essentially wipe all your work out and restart. So that is one issue that you do face, and you have to find this balance between evolution and consistency, which has always been a struggle, but also part of the role.
Yeah, it's such a great point, right? Because like I sent something to somebody today where they were looking at evolution in league trends, and one of the columns was how often teams ran RPO, run pass options, which are relatively new phenomena in football. And I had to explain to this person, like, we've only been charting this since 2017. So every year it's going to look like no teams ever ran RPOs until 2017, and there was this huge jump. And it's like every time I build a model to try to like contextualize something, I have to remember that prior to this year, the RPO variable is always going to be a 0, right? And like, and you know, it's, you know, the process of, you know, Sarah's point, the process of being like of updating things also includes the process of probably discarding some of the things that you've already done, which is frustrating. And you're never going to have like, you know, as you guys said, we only have NGS back to, I think, 2017, maybe 2016, I can't remember, but like, you know, that process is also going to be like, if you're going to build your models based on tracking data, like that sample size might not be big enough. So then what do? You have to incorporate data from prior to that. Well, you know, how do you merge those two things? It's a really interesting problem. And one that I'm assuming, you know, these teams that change infrastructure year after year after year don't have that. That's part of that eats into their analytics edge, is the having to restart all the time.
Yeah, I want to bring in a question here from one of our attendees. Speaking of this, have there been any attempts to, so the question is, have there been any attempts to quantify the abilities of players coming out of college to aid in scouting observations to teams making the draft process, whether it be through combine testing data, pro days, or statistics in college games? I suppose, Sarah, perhaps this is to you. How do you see in sort of the NFL front office this integration of trying to scout amateur collegiate players?
Yeah, I mean, definitely that goes into the discussion on grades and using the scouting data that you have and the combine information. You're using all the information that you have from their college and trying to find little bits that that maybe you can't see on film, or that analytics can kind of point out, especially in the later rounds. I find, you know, when you're in the early rounds of a draft, it's fairly obvious who's superior in certain positions. But once you get into the later round, that's when analytics can really hone in on some of the intricacies and differences between players, that, hey, this guy might have a slight edge according to our model. And maybe it's in a certain area. Maybe you separate by, he did really well in the combine, and the combine shown to be somewhat predictive for CFAs or for 7th round picks. Whatever it might be that you're looking at, you can kind of separate into the different groups and just help. Like I say, I think analytics is most valuable in those like 4th to 7th round in CFAs, just because it's, again, as I say, it's a tool, and it's one of those tools that you get a different perspective.
Thank you. Question to Zach. One of the sort of on the note of scouting, this player tracking data that Next Gen Stats is bringing in, do you think this is opening up the possibility for even like robot scouting, sort of automated scouting, where you'll be able to go through several hours worth of film just automatically? Do you think that this is, I guess, how do you think this is helpful? And you know, what are the sort of upsides and downsides to this as opposed to like traditional scouting methods of watching film?
So I kind of alluded to it earlier, but I think one of the things that like new technology can bring is like speeding up the process. So where something like a padding a game could take, you know, a couple hours, you can get things like route recognition, coverage recognition, things like that. You know, I know the current Big Data Bowl is related to a lot of defensive side, just because that's something that, you know, at least publicly has been, you know, kind of something that's hard to study and get stable. So I'm really interested to see what's brought there. But I think that speed of just getting like faster results, and then you know, we can still back it up, still double check things, but getting those results quickly and cutting down on that time so you can kind of attack other areas, I think could definitely be really useful.
Thank you. Josh, I know you've been doing some work on defensive analysis with respect to like play action and that sort of thing. What are some of the challenges with creating statistics like this for defense compared to offense?
Defense is incredibly difficult, and I think one of the main reasons is what we've already talked about, is just a lack of stake in the ground statistics that you can point to and say, okay, this is the ground truth of performance that I can measure against, and now I know I'm on the right track. So in defense, what I tried to do with play action was I tried to see how much movement there was when a team ran play action over and over and over and over again, and see if that, what defender continued to be fooled. And it turned out that there really wasn't much difference, that a defenders are taught at an early age that you do your run fits, and that's their number one job if you're a linebacker or a box safety. So I think at least I have only used the next gen data thus far to basically confirm my priors, unfortunately. When you have labeled data from people like PFF, it's hard to see, other than what Zach was talking about, that instant kind of aspect of the next gen stats. It's hard to see the relative value there currently in what's been produced in like route recognition and things like that with this very granular next gen data. But everyone's working really hard to try and find the next huge breakthrough. And I'm sure that there are tons of edges still out there to be had, but it's difficult work. I think if you ask anyone who's worked with that data, or if you've been poked around in the Big Data Bulls data set this year, you can kind of get a sense of just how difficult it can be.
Thank you. Sort of to your point, it is sort of hard to find what is the biggest area in which is it defensive trying to measure analytically about defense or offense, or where is it? Sarah, just to bring you in here, what do you think is sort of the biggest value add for individual teams that analytics is providing right now? What's the main, or if there's more than one area you think that analytics is sort of currently providing the most value? And maybe just as a general question to everybody, where do you think in the future we can go that maybe analytics for football isn't providing as much value now, but could in the future?
And you said the word heterogeneity. I think that's the biggest thing, is being able to deal with heterogeneity is the biggest possible value add in analytics currently. So if I'm drafting a quarterback and I'm playing in a scheme like the Rams, and I run a decent amount of play action, and I move the pocket 5% of the time when the league averages 3% of the time, and I throw crossing routes X%, all that kind of stuff. And I can look at a player's college data and sort of properly weigh those things, properly weigh what's stable, what's not. If I can draw a distribution about how they're going to do based upon those things, and properly value not only what my mean projection would be for that player, but also the uncertainty surrounding it, and be able to make bets that way, whether that be through the draft or free agency. To me, right now is something that is, I think people are solving, as we speak. And I think it's something that adds a lot of value, because, my biggest thing, and again, I've had, relationships with teams through my job, and the biggest refrain whenever I say something absolute is always, well, but my situation's different. And, and I can, and almost every time I've had somebody explain it to me, their situation is different. And so when I say so-and-so is not a good guard, why are you signing this person? They'll say, well, because I can get him for this much money, and in our scheme, he's actually worth that much money. And you take a look back and you're saying, well, these people actually have pretty good intuition about this. Could we actually model that? And to me, that's, I think, where you can find a decent, you can solve some pretty cool problems in football analytics right now.
Yeah, Sarah, I want to move to you. What do you think, sort of continue on this question, what do you think is sort of the biggest area you see, for instance, with the Rams, that analytics is really contributing to team success?
And I think a lot of what you see in media is, it's directed to the public and to be fancy and cool, which isn't necessarily the case with teams. I think the biggest thing is just finding pieces of information. I think I've had the most impact on our sports science side, which is not usually talked about, and our our scouting side as well. We use it quite a bit. The degree of that impact, you just never know. You just provide people information and hope that it's received well, but it's definitely evolved since I've been here. And I think a lot of the areas that aren't necessarily sexy per se are some of the biggest used areas. So that's been my experience. I'm not sure, like from a coaching perspective, like you say, there's just so many scenarios and intuition that it's really just a little tool. It's just in their playbook or in the scout book as of now, but that there's definitely room for evolution.
Thank you. I see a lot of questions in the chat that are asking about sort of general just career background or career advice. Perhaps we can start with you, Zach. I know, we personally know each other. I remember back when you were working at Numberfire. But maybe you can talk a little bit about how, and we'll go to everyone else here as well. But we can start off with you. Talk about maybe a little how you got into sports analytics, especially starting off as a student, the types of things you did in order to get started in the field, and maybe any advice you have for people that are looking to get started similarly.
Yeah, so I think the thing that was biggest for me was just kind of, finally just starting and diving in and, start with like one question that's, not like basic where you're not challenging yourself, but it's easily enough to find an answer at some point down the road, and you kind of just learn as you go. And instead of trying to learn everything from a textbook, right off the bat and then start answering things, it's like, I'm going to start with something that works. It runs. It's not, good code. It's not, traditionally how it's supposed to be done, but it works. And now I can start to improve it from there and kind of start to like contribute to that, to the public. I know teams have hired people based off things they posted their work on Twitter before. I mean, obviously they've done more than that, but it's just like getting that recognition, getting work out there. I think the quant major is obviously important just for learning, but like, I graduated in 5 years and I didn't even have the major I started with. I had to change. So it's not like, I don't think that should be the main focus. I don't think you should worry as much about that, but it's like learning kind of on just Googling, learning to code, learning outside of the classroom, just because you're interested in it. Like if you really are interested in it, then you'll be able to get through different projects and start to just pick things up along the way. And I think that kind of natural learning is really effective. And I think it's probably the best, because if you're just in a classroom, they're going to give you a clean data set, and that's not really that good of experience, because it's pretty basic questions that are meant to be answered and have a distinct answer. So I think kind of using that real world data is really good experience.
Thank you. Maybe Eric, maybe you can talk a little bit about your career path and again, any advice?
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably a little bit different because I entered analytics, especially in football. Like I think I always say if it was a year earlier, a year later, I probably wouldn't be where I am. But I'm somebody who degree in math. I was a math professor for 6 years. I got into football because I was sort of bored and disenchanted with what I was doing at the time. And I always assumed that people were doing like really heady football work. Like I always thought like, I spent 4 years getting a PhD in something, and I thought that was sort of what you had to do anything. And I think that that's wrong. Like, yeah, if you are willing to work hard and you're willing to ask questions and you're willing to look stupid sometimes because you're wrong, and you're willing to, pick yourself up and be humble about things, like I think you can learn most of anything. So, when I got into PFF, I just did it because I liked football, and I, wanted to, I thought it was the coolest thing that somebody would pay me to write on a website about football. And then eventually, my colleague George Shahuri and I started building our R&D group while I was still a math professor. And then eventually it just got to a point where I was doing football stuff way more than I was doing in my actual real job. And so, now we run our group, full time, from where Chris, moved the company to. And now that we're hiring people, I almost always say, like, they always ask me like, okay, what did you do? I'm like, well, don't replicate what I did. I wasted, 10 years of my life doing other things. If you want to do football analytics, I think Zach's advice is probably as good as it is. Find a problem, work on it, solve it, be the best at that thing. And then, it's kind of a magical thing that happens when you solve a problem really well. It's actually a lot easier to solve other problems really well. And you sort of get more flexible. And, the people that we've hired over the last few years are the people that I inquire to hire even. People we reach out to are almost always people we see on the internet, producing solutions we'd like to see on our site, and solutions we like to see for our clients and things like that. So it's always that public thing. I mean, it's so crazy. I don't know, Josh, if you feel this way as well, but like, being our age now, it's like, I don't think my degree or my experience is enough anymore, right? Like now there's so much more competition for, internships, REUs, all that kind of stuff at the college level, that you sort of need that. It's doing well in the classroom is simply not good enough anymore. You have to do something extracurricular or something to set yourself apart. And I think just like carving your own path, doing the thing you love, and, doing creative things publicly, as scary as that is probably the best way to go about it.
Yeah, I think, my previous life, I was an entrepreneur and still am. And I think that mindset is probably the most useful one to have when you're doing anything that's highly competitive. In other terms, you need to view this as a marketplace that you need to rise and stand out in. And the easiest way to do that is to do compelling work, solve people's problems in a compelling way, and to let them know about it. And those are all kind of discrete problems, right? First, you need to have a skill set that you're learning at Ohio State or wherever you're at. And you need to leverage that to an interesting problem that other people find interesting, or a solution that other people want. And then you need to get people to pay attention. So you need to yell and scream loud enough for people to actually take notice. So I think those are the three steps, but they're all kind of revolve around networking in some way or form. And the easiest way to do that these days is on places like Twitter. There's Open Source Football, which is a friend of mine, Ben Baldwin, has been working on. You can post things on there. I don't think that's enough. But that's certainly a place to do it. Get yourself published there. But yeah, I think you view yourself as an independent contractor and market yourself that way is probably my best advice.
All right, thank you. Sarah, any thoughts on your career path and advice you have for aspiring football analysts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm, I guess, less removed from school. I graduated, I guess my undergrad was over 5 years ago. And from my perspective, like kind of going in what Zach was saying, you just don't be afraid to take a risk. Like I jumped from my undergrad in math to master's in stats, and I'll be the first to tell you my first semester was terrible. I was completely in over my head. It was a bigger jump than what I thought, going from math to statistics. But kind of just having those different tools in your background. I was a college athlete, so it was super competitive. I wasn't gonna quit. I wasn't gonna kind of let anything really drag you down, and just exposing myself to certain situations that I didn't think that I would get into. Like I did the MBA hackathon. I didn't think I'd get accepted for it. I applied as an individual, and I did. I ended up getting accepted for that, and just applying even for this job. I didn't think that I would be able to be in the running, just a cold kind of application without knowing anyone, and just being confident in your work. There was less like Twitter. I didn't have Twitter in college, so it was more, I got papers published and did research with professors and tried to combine different interests, where I always found working with a professor was the best outlet, because they've been through the publishing route. They know how to get it done. They know what needs to be said and kind of the form of the paper. Yeah, I mean, now I guess it is a lot of Twitter, but I think the way you deliver your work is very important. A lot of people will send cold emails and can come across very arrogant and all-knowing. And so while being confident is key, it's also understanding that you're shoving things down someone's throat. Like don't don't shove a 60-page paper into a person's email. They probably can't read it all. Try and be concise and get your point across in the best way where I can understand it, but also someone with no statistical background can understand it.
Yeah, I echo what Sarah said. I got actually 2 emails today basically with that exact like premise, which was like, have you guys ever thought of this? And here's my tome on this particular topic. And it's like, those almost never get read. I don't know. I don't read, barely have any time for those. And again, it's tough because as Josh said, I do agree, like, confidence is a big deal, and confidence is really, a lack of it is going to have give you a difficult, part through the door. But, Josh was saying also about networking. Sarah, like, you not only went to a good master's program, but you went to a master's program with a pretty well-known like group of people doing sports statistics that, that was sort of a good marketing tool as well that didn't require social media. Which I think was very smart like that. But those are few and far between. And, and most, like when I was teaching, math, I had absolutely no connection. So if my student wanted to do sports analytics, like I would not have been able to really get them anywhere. So there's also just being smart as well, which, picking the right people to work with.
Yeah, I definitely, when I was looking for master's programs, that was the first curriculum, is you have to have someone doing something in sports analytics, because I knew it's what I wanted to do my thesis in and what I wanted to get involved in. And the only way is if you're going to have an advisor that supports that and can support it.
Bringing in another question from the chat here, Sarah, a few people have been asking, how much of a role does analytics play for the Rams in terms of like player operations? Specifically, the 2 questions I see here about the draft and trades. How much depends on how much you can share about this, but are analytics something that's a big part of the decision process there? Is that something that you work on at all personally?
In terms of trades, we've done little projects here and there, more so for contract extensions than trading. We don't do a lot with trades, to be honest. I'm usually hear about it when other people do. In the draft process, I think it varies. We're involved in all the meetings. Really, you have your analytics projections, you have your scout projections, your GM projections, and it is used as a tool. Again, I can't really judge how much it's used in the final decision if it's taken into consideration. I know that there are players that we didn't take that I'm very glad we didn't, and I know that there are players that we did that analytics also agreed with. So it's kind of a balance. You give it, again, it's just a piece of information. You give the information. At the end of the day, the GM makes the final decision.
All right. Looking to the future of football analytics, I suppose this is sort of a question for everyone here, but perhaps we can start with you, Josh. We've seen some of this tracking data and that sort of thing have a big impact. What do you think is the next sort of big frontier for football analytics? Where do you think the next leap forward is going to be?
I think we've alluded a bit to it, but it'll be the combination of smart scouting and quantifying it in a way and understanding the uncertainty of it that allows you to make, marginally better decisions. I think one of the things that I had hoped for that I don't know is happening in quite the way that I thought it would is that using the rich data that we have at our fingertips now about quarterback play, I thought we might be able to get better at projecting those folks. And if you talk to guys that are trying to project from the college to the pros these days, they'll tell you no one knows anything. And I don't think that's entirely true. But I do think that there's still a lot of room. If you come up with something really, really great on projecting that quarterback, those quarterbacks from college to the pros, you're going to make a huge impact in whatever team you land on. And so I would be putting my effort into that continually. But I think the Big Data Bowl has there's a lot of hope there in finding some way to measure defense in a way that we can reliably say this team or this player is going to do X, Y, or Z consistently into the future. And I think that would be a wonderful thing, because football gets a little stale when all you talk about are the offensive players who touch the ball and generate statistics. It'd be great if we could say, something really interesting and credible, in terms of what's likely to happen in the future about defensive players outside of maybe edge rushers.
Yeah, what do you think, Eric? What do you think is sort of maybe a frontier that we can begin exploring?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're already sort of getting there, but like this idea, Sarah was talking about combine data, which has a ton of value. I think measuring athleticism using on-field data is something that has a lot of promise, at least from my initial work. I also think and this is information that the teams likely have that me as an outsider doesn't have, but just sort of mental makeup, some sort of, because I think, Josh, that's a huge deal as what you're talking about the college to pro quarterback play, right? Like there was a quarterback, I'm not going to name his name, that you liked, I liked, everybody and their grandma liked. And there was a piece of information that like one of my friends gave me that, we would never have access to, that might be the reason why he's not particularly good at the NFL level. Well, that's stuff that I don't know if that's anecdotal. I don't know if that's real. But it'd be really nice to sort of get a new set of data to be at least be able to test that and add a few percentage points to our ability to be able to predict those guys. So, and again, like I said, I think teams probably have more access to this information than we do, but a way to sort of think about mental makeup of players, and in a way that's ethical, because, I know a lot of it is just, classism and stuff like that as well. So it's just a really tough problem, but it's one that probably helps us get to, with on-field data is probably what is an irreducible problem at this point.
All right. Another question from some of our attendees. This one's for Josh. From a writer's perspective, are you seeing a trend in NFL front offices where owners gravitate towards general managers with backgrounds in analytics? Is this an essential piece to background as a candidate? And do you think that it's possible to succeed as a general manager without analytics? I suppose from your perspective, writing football.
Yeah, I think it's hugely rare that analytics or that being the major thrust of what makes you a desirable GM candidate. I don't think that's at the top of anyone's list, and I don't think it will be for a while. I think analytics would need to prove itself in a way that no one is really incentivized to show right now. If you're winning with analytics right now, you've come from probably another sport. You've probably seen what's happened in these other sports when information is evenly distributed throughout the league and edges disappear. I think if you're winning with analytics right now, you're just not talking about it. And because you're not talking about it, you're probably also not building enough buzz around the thing itself to get you hired because of it. So there's this kind of chicken or the egg thing with these folks who are winning with it right now. Eventually, the people who have been successful, who are successful, have true edges that exploit them. Eventually, the word will get out, and those people will matriculate up and find themselves in GM roles. But I don't know. I don't know that that's imminent.
How far away do you think that might be, if it's even possible? I know things like when the salary cap first got implemented, that was a catalyst for GMs coming in later that were sort of salary cap specialists, people like Howie Roseman or something like that. Do you think that analytics is something that might lead towards that in 10, 15? I mean, are we headed in that direction, or is that just not the sort of thing that analytics is going to lend itself to?
I think it will. I think we will get there. I think we might be 10 years away from our first analytics GM. I guess we've had some, like the Browns have certainly, promoted and hired folks with an analytics bent. Baltimore certainly promotes and hires people with an analytics bent. And the Eagles, as you mentioned, they certainly have an analytics bent. There are teams out there that value it. But I guess what I would like to see is a complete fresh start at some franchise that has been, not doing well for a long time, and have someone come in and just be given the full reins to hire their staff as they see fit, from the top to bottom with an evidence-based analytical pipeline and decision-making pipeline. And I think we're a ways away from that.
Josh, didn't we? I mean, we sort of had that in Cleveland in a sort of a halfway, right? And the small sample size nature of football plus the huge dependence on the quarterback position made them unsuccessful, right? Like, and that probably set evidence-based analysis back at least a little bit. Yeah.
Certainly agree. I think though that, Sashi was, trying to do something that not all analytics people even agree with. There are people who push back to me all the time about tanking and think it's just not appropriate for football because of the culture is stained because of it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's more to it than that. And perhaps Sashi wasn't actually a very good manager. He would leave early when all the rest of his staff is out there grinding, and there's a kind of a mismatch between, the guy at the top and the people underneath him. And so I think there's a lot of things that go into it. And so it'll take the right candidate. And again, I want to emphasize the teams that are doing well with this right now, they don't advertise it. So
yeah, that's probably the best point, is that, like, if you have it, you're not, I mean, concealing that information is probably extremely valuable.
All right, I see another question from our Q&A, perhaps to you, Zach. How do you see the NFL collaborating with emerging technologies, sports science, for deeper analytics that dives into the question is about injury risk, performance enhancement, for instance. But since you do work for the NFL, I'm not sure exactly how much Next Gen Stats gets into this stuff, but how does the NFL collaborating with sort of these emerging technologies look to you?
So in terms of like injury and sports science stuff, that's something that that's not like my team that I work on. That's nothing that we do. That's kind of kept separate, probably for the good, just because, I don't know about sports science at all. So, but yeah, that's one of the things that we don't really cover. But I think, it is something that is, like Sarah was saying, that's something that she works on a lot. And in the public eye, it's not really covered as much. But I do, if you kind of go to like a Sloan, I went probably, I think it was 4 years ago now, and every other booth was a sports science thing. And that kind of blew my mind about how much was out there even 4 years ago. So I think it is something that, the NFL does a lot of work on with player safety. And we've kind of seen a lot of those changes, but specifically with like what I do, we don't really do anything with it.
All right, maybe Sarah, you can chime in on this, something that you have experience with.
Yeah, I think it all goes back to, kind of what Josh was saying, and getting those little, like, if you can be like 1% better. So just sports science is an area where you can be 1% better. So if you can get those wins, and you can take it. In terms of working on injury risk and stuff, it's hard because you get injured in the game, and that's kind of what you know about other teams, but you don't know what they did leading up to it. You don't know how they trained. You don't know their technology that they use. So you really only have information on your own data. And there's only certain types of injuries that you could possibly lower the probability of occurring, but really it's football. So you're going to get hit and you're going to get hurt. So it's taking that with a grain of salt when you limit the injuries that you can look at, when you limit to your team, when you limit what background you have on that player. You really end up with quite a small sample. So it's just working with what you have, kind of finding little trends in the data that you might see, maybe reevaluating what is an injury. Maybe it's on injury, maybe it's fatigue, maybe it's on their personal wellness surveys. They indicated they're tired, and that's your new outcome. Or maybe it's, they had a slowdown in their accelerations on a standardized drill. Those kind of things that you could consider. Is it there yet? Not quite. There's not necessarily standardized drills that they're willing to do. I always try and beg for the practice squad, but no one lets me. So there's different areas to look at, but I do think it's an area of growth, and it's one that, again, you can if you can limit the probability of a soft tissue injury occurring, then why not take it into consideration?
All right, so we're almost out of time. I'm going to bring in one final question from the Q&A. So let's see. Just quick question for, I suppose, everybody. We've seen a lot of teams lose fairly close games where they've, for instance, scored too soon, didn't run out the clock quite successfully. For instance, with Todd Gurley and Atlanta versus Detroit. What do you think is the cause of this? Is this coaches just not being aware of it, the players not being aware of it? Is this sort of the analytics behind that? What are your thoughts about this? Perhaps Eric, we can go with you.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think Sarah could probably answer this better than me, but in my interactions with teams, I would say that teams have an awful lot on their plate week to week. And one of the things we've been able to help teams with at PFF is filtering video quicker, all that kind of stuff, reducing the amount of work they have. There's a ton of stuff they got to do from, Sunday night when their game's over to the next Sunday. And, a lot of that is self-scouting. A lot of that's opponent scouting. Relatively little of it, from what I can tell, is these sort of thinking through these edge cases of games. Hopefully analytics can be something where teams are doing less of the former stuff and more of the latter. But, it's sort of like when Vrabel put the 12th man on the field against Houston and drew a penalty to get rid of one of the first downs that Houston could accumulate, give them more time. Like, that was clearly something that either he or one of the members of his staff thought through and said, hey, if you get into this situation, this might be something you want to consider. That's awesome. And that's thinking about an edge case ahead of time, but that clearly was because he was able to, because some of his time was freed up from doing the onerous tasks that a lot of them have to do throughout the week. I think, to me, a lot of that is just simply not, just allocating time differently. And a lot of that is just inertia from the way that things have always been done. But that's been my impression in talking with some teams, is that hopefully analytics can help them not so much think about the grind week to week on stuff and start thinking about the little, edge cases that they can, dominate, over their opponents, a couple times every season.
All right. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming to this football panel. Our sports media panel will be coming up next in just a few minutes. Thank you, Sarah, Eric, Josh, and Zach, for coming. This was an absolutely wonderful panel. Happy to have you here. In the meantime, as I said, the sports media panel should be coming up. So you'll be able to wait a couple minutes for that. And thank you all for coming.
Thanks, guys. Go Bucks.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming in, guys.
Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate it.